Welcome, everybody, and happy Easter to you. You are listening to In the Company of Charity podcasts, and this is Sister Liz, and I'm here with Sister Elizabeth, my dear sister friend. Hey,
Hi,
how are you?
Sister Liz. I'm so good. I had such a great, had a really a kind of intense Lent,
Mm,
but such an amazing, transforming Holy Week. I can't really describe like what one thing happened, but yeah, it's been so beautiful um, and it's just been great to be here in St. Louis, to be here in the seminary, and to just really have time to reflect on what this time has been. It's been very, very transformative, very peaceful, but also very deep. So I'm really just grateful for this time.
well, don't you love Easter? And we go to the Easter Vigil, of course, and it's a very long, and there's a lot of different pieces to the Mass, but that Easter fire and the candles and the Exultet, it just is so cool.
Yeah, it really is. We're again, as I said, we're in the Archdiocese of St. Louis is kind of going through their own transformation with parishes and you know, priest shortages and things like that, which seems really, really sad. But there was just a sense of church and community coming together. Like these are the times when people show up and they come and they worship together and there was just something about it that was like a family gathering that just felt so wonderful and so healing. And sadly, for some of these parishes it may be the last time they have these services in their worship space, you know but it doesn't diminish who the church is here, that these services are so filled with ritual and the beauty of the newness of the new fire and just thinking, okay, like what is the new fire of the new ways? The diocese movement in trying to revitalize parishes is called All Things New, right? And so that's the process. And I just kind of felt the power of it really this time, and but also realizing that there's kind of pain in the midst of it, and yet that God will heal it. I'm sure of that. I could feel it this week. Yeah.
What a great, yeah. I mean, please enjoy Easter. There's a reason that the Easter season is longer than Lent. We have the joy of the Lord even in
Mhm.
the midst of difficulties and challenges, but God is walking with us and present in an even deeper way, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on us chatting because we have a great episode coming up with Nipun. And maybe if you want to just tell us a little bit about him and he just seems like a really amazing human.
Yeah.
So
Nipun Mehta is just an amazing human being. You're absolutely right. And I was looking when in the interview, we don't talk a lot about him specifically, but this accomplishment of creating this what he calls an ecosystem. It's like a cyber ecosystem, I think, called ServiceSpace. And some people may have come across it and didn't know. Many people, I think, and I know from different sisters I've talked with, and other people get an email. They come out every day or every week called Daily Good, and that is one of the products from Service Space. There's Awaken Circles, and there's kindness challenges, and there's all kinds of different ways in which this creation, as he calls it, this ecosystem that they've created, and you'll hear more about it in the interview, um, just kind of really touches people's hearts and brings out this sense of kindness and gentleness and a sense of giving. And he talks a little bit, about how simple it was. He was a young man and he was in Silicon Valley and I just kept thinking, and as you listen to this episode, in your minds, think about Frederick Ozanam, the young college student who said to himself, it really was challenged, right? Somebody said to him, show us if, your faith and works, right? Well, if you have faith, show me your works. And Frederick and his friends had to kind of say, well, wow, okay, my faith isn't dead, but where are my works? That sense that faith without works is dead. And that's what moved Ozanam talk a little bit about Vincent, with that question from Madame de Gandhi, what must be done to heal the suffering of the people? Nipun kind of, and his friends, these early days in the late 1990s, but early days of their careers, kind of looked at their lives and said, what are we doing? He calls it the greed train at one point in the interview. It's very, very interesting. But I wanted to share, it's very hard when you're talking to humble people who don't want to necessarily tell you all of their accolades. And so in his own bio, I realized as I was reading it that this is a guy who was invited and appointed by President Obama on a council for social change. He was recognized by the Dalai Lama, as an unsung hero of compassion. And Germany's magazine, I'm not familiar about that, but named him in 2020 the top 100 most inspiring people. He was on that list. He's just an amazing human being. And when you hear the interview, I think you're going to hear that he's simple and complex. He's very funny and very deep. There's just so many. I just admire this guy so much, and it's it will be obvious in the interview. I'm enamored. I just think he's such a wonderful human being, and the work, not just the work he's done, but the way in which he has created a space to inspire people to goodness, to kindness, is just amazing to me. And again, I keep going back to the image of Frederick Ozanam as a young man being challenged to say, the path of being an intellectual isn't getting him kind of the spiritual creds he wants, that sense that what's God really calling? How does my faith come alive? And in his connection to Rosalie Rondeau, this wonderful sister of ours back in the 1800s, spurred the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. And this, young man in the 1990s, again, looking for a way to make social change. And from that comes ServiceSpace, which has touched the lives of 500,000 people. I mean, some incredibly enormous number of people. So I can't say enough about it. Just can't.
Yeah, I love that. It really, I think, like music and silence and beauty, this service and the universal values of kindness and love and generosity and humility, like it cuts through all of the extra, and it brings so many people together, people of faith and people of different faiths. And what a great blessing and great gift to the world, Nipun and this work is. So enjoy this episode, everybody. You guys can always get in touch with us at our email address, companyofcharity@gmail.com. And of course, tag this episode to your friends, send it out to them through the link, or post it on social media. This is a really, really good one. You're going to love it.
Hi, everyone. This is Sister Elizabeth, and you're listening to In the Company of Charity, the podcast of the Daughters of Charity. And I cannot tell you how excited I am today to have our guest, Nipun Mehta, who is the founder of ServiceSpace. And some of you may not have heard of ServiceSpace, or you may have, and it's like the most incredible thing ever. He's the founder of that. He's had an incredible life of service and of generosity and of goodness. And he and I met through a coronavirus experiment, almost in ServiceSpace. So I'm going to let him tell you a lot more about that. But I'm just so happy to welcome Nipun to the podcast today. Nipun, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Sister Elizabeth. Thank you for having me on. I'm just excited to be in conversation with you.
That's great. Well, let's start the conversation. Tell us a little bit about how ServiceSpace began. Where did this idea come from? What in your own life was happening that could have brought this about? And then we can talk more about the ServiceSpace pods where you and I met.
Yeah, I think for me, it was really about reconnecting with that heart of service, with that heart of generosity. Now, I grew up in the Silicon Valley, and in the Silicon Valley, especially in the late 90s when I was coming out of college, it was this whole dot-com era. The internet has just gone mainstream. Everyone's just trying to think of bigger, better, faster. And I kind of, you're expected to get on that train. And I saw where that train was headed. And I was like, man, this is a train wreck. I can't, this is not right. So first step was, I don't want to get on that train. And the second step was, man, I don't think all the people on that train want to be on that train either, And so I was like, well, how can I be of service? And so initially, you're 20 something, like we had never run an organization or had any change the world ideas, nothing. It was just a simple intent. And I think that's how, so we would organize in small ways. So we would have like homeless drives, this is pre-service space. We just get together and we say, well, there is suffering in the world and our hearts want to respond to that. And that's the awakening of compassion. And so you say, okay, well, how, we would go out and make meals, with our own hands, and we would go and we call them help the homeless drives. This is like very early, like almost teen years, got a bunch of our friends together. San Francisco, we took over like a giant warehouse, a friend's warehouse. It was a wood shop, and we would make these, brown bag lunches. And then as we did that, we realized that we don't want to just help the homeless. We want to hear the homeless. We didn't want to just give out sandwiches. We actually just wanted to share a meal with them. And that's what we would do. And then you saw that, and Sister Elizabeth, you have way more experience than I do, but these can be very formative experiences early on where you just kind of see that, man, like I was offering one meal and then to a hungry person, and that hungry person's like, I'm going to save it because I have another friend who's not here right now who is hungrier than I am. And or you see somebody like just wanting to say thank you, and they give you a small little coin that they found, and it's like the most precious thing they have. And it just kind of opens you up in a very different way, And so here I was on one side, there's this whole .com thing going, and on the other side, there's these very small, you can say, seemingly insignificant, but yet for the heart, incredibly opening. And you're like, wow, who do I want to be when I grow up? And I realized I wanted to have that kind of a bigger heart. So from there, we were like, well, what can we do? What is ours to do in the world? And that also is another hard question. But we actually ended up going to a homeless shelter as our first project. And it wasn't even a project. We didn't have an organization. We just walked in and we just said, we can't do what you're doing. What you're doing is amazing. But, we're a bunch of young people. There are 4 of us. We could help you with something, what can we do? And we ended up building them a website. And it was an incredible, the website, at that time, they didn't even know what a website was. Like, I think the executive director of the shelter is like, first she's like, do we really need this? And I was like, yeah, it's good for you. You can get online donations, all this. And then she comes in and she's like, okay, fine. Okay, I trust you. You guys seem like nice guys. I don't really understand what this internet thing is. And she gives us like a screwdriver, and says, we said, what's this for? She says, to put it inside my computer. And I was like, no, we can do this from our homes. And she's like, what kind of volunteering is this? And so that was, that's how we started. But what was meaningful about it, sure, there's a website and things like that, but what was meaningful is that it opened our hearts. We were like, man, this is something that we want to keep doing. And so we came back and we said, let's do it again. And we ended up building thousands of websites, and for nonprofits. And of course, tens of thousands of people had joined. But it was all serendipitous. We didn't have a marketing plan. We didn't have a fundraising strategy. We didn't do any of that. It was just all word of mouth. And it's, of course, it started with web stuff. Then it got into, web portals. Like we said, we started creating these portals around like good news and kindness, which the world didn't have, and still, unfortunately, has very few of those. And then it got into a lot of offline work, and it just kind of keeps evolving. But at the core of it, I think is this connecting with that open heart, and staying open-hearted, and being in a community of other people who are also trying to open their heart, which gives you strength to, to not shut down when the going gets tough. So for us, it was, it's a little bit of, in a way, it's like a lemon. I still think of it as a lemonade stand. It's like the thing is, it's easy to start a lemonade stand. It's hard for you to stay as a lemonade stand 23 years later. And so I think of that as an accomplishment that we are still a lemonade stand.
I love this story because, as I said, we never even met in person, but we've been together through the ServiceSpace pods that resulted during coronavirus, because obviously you couldn't be doing the same kind of hands-on, in-person kind of volunteerism that many of the people part of ServiceSpace were doing, like going out with smile cards and free hugs and all these acts of love and kindness couldn't be done anymore. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the pods, but I just wanted to kind of respond. I find it really interesting, as you were saying, this was in the 1990s, correct?
Yeah,
like 23 years ago. So
yeah.
I was leaving my life in the world at around the same time, and I was like 36 years old. I entered the community in 1996, but I had been discerning a few years before that. So in some ways, we were providentially on the same journey away from a world that was kind of calling us to other things like, do I get a better job? Do I try to get the better job? Do I try to do this? And I can remember saying to someone once, I just have this sense that I'm always going to be poor. I didn't come from a big rich family or anything like that, but that I was not even going to be that. Right. There was just something about that. But knew I didn't want to really live a voluntary poverty out on the streets or something like that. I wanted to be of service to people.
I think we are held by larger winds. I think we sometimes tend to feel even that decision, like for me or for anyone, for perhaps you. I don't know if you frame it this way, but for me, it certainly feels that way. That it's not that I and all my ego was deciding to do this. It was so much serendipity. It was so much happenstance. It was so much grace, where if I wasn't in that right place at the right time, not just for ServiceSpace to explode, but for my heart to stay open, for me even to want to aspire to have an open heart, like that itself took so many conditions. And it's just like barely hanging by a thread. And so I don't think we can go into these things and say, draw linear lines of causality, and so I think, even ServiceSpace, when we started in April 1999, again, as like these four people, nothing, like we were like, okay, midnight, what's a good name of an organization? Okay, what's available as a domain name? We're like, it's midnight, let's just get something out, and we chose charity focus. And years later, we realized we don't do much charity and we're not focused either. So then it became ServiceSpace.
That's funny. So what would you call ServiceSpace now? I mean, it is a domain, it's a platform, what exactly would you call it? Because it is nebulous. I have to say, when I tell people I'm coming on a pod call or something, I always say it's my writing group, because I don't know what else always to say, and then I try to explain it, and I'm like, yeah, but it's really the coolest thing ever, and I absolutely love it. And so what is it exactly? What is it?
I would say it's an ecosystem, but it's a polyculture ecosystem. So if you look at like farming, and if you just see rows and rows and rows of apples, it's very easy to define, and you say this is an apple farm. But if you actually go to a really rich like permaculture farm, it doesn't look like a farm at all. It's many things growing in many different ways. And what's beautiful about it is that the roots are all connected to each other's roots. And that's what gives it that resiliency. So that one apple from a permaculture farm is going to taste way richer because inside that one apple are, nutrients from that entire forest. And so ServiceSpace is in a way an ecosystem. They have, so if you're a writer, you could, for that kind of a person that wants to reflect in community, there's those opportunities. If you want to volunteer, there's those opportunities. If you want to create local projects, there's those opportunities. If you just want to be inspired and just receive an email a day of, we have this email called Daily Good for, I think, the last, I think it was even before ServiceSpace formally started. Every single day, a little bit of good news, because, if you have that in your inner ecosystem, it helps and inspires you to do good. So there's just unending amounts of things. There's 20,000 people that come to our portals every hour, so it's a lot of people, and they're doing a lot of different things. And so there's a whole engagement spectrum. But to define an organization by a product or by a project is just so limiting. Like the way we think of it, like in an ecosystem, what is the organizing principle? Those are your values. And so for us, we have 3 core values that from day one to now we have stuck with. And those are kind of simple, but if you nuance them, there's actually a lot there, and a very basic, the 3 values are: one is you be volunteer run. Which again, at that time, very counterculture, because everyone's talking about a lot of staff. So when you are volunteer run, what you do is you connect with intrinsic motivators. And how far can intrinsic motivators go? And how, we know that even when you get paid, right, extrinsic motivators, you have, when they mix with intrinsic motivators, they sort of have a lower ceiling. But if it's purely intrinsic, and you know this more than anybody else as a nun, it's like you're motivated by a very different resource inside you that's regenerative. And so we became a pool of volunteers, but a pool really of intrinsic motivators. And that has its own intelligence. That has its own field of grace that starts to operate. And I don't think we have enough examples of that. The second principle was that we're not going to do any fundraising. And again, that's a very radical for a nonprofit to say we're never going to fill out a fundraising app. But underneath it, I think it was probably closest to what Saint Benedict said: ask nothing, refuse nothing, kind of an attitude. That, look, just trust in the larger forces of our interconnection, on the larger forces, whatever word you use for it. You could even just say grace. Just wait till grace happens. Just keep serving. That's your job. And whatever you receive, you work with that. And when you do that, you realize that, I once gave a talk, I think it was titled, I had provocatively titled it, Can You Create Social Change Without Money? Because everybody thinks that without money, you can't do anything. And I just don't think that's true. And so although this is a very simple principle, it actually can go pretty deep. And then the third thing was do small acts. That, yes, of course, there's place in the world for let's change the world, affect 2 billion people, and let's do it tomorrow, and I think there are many people who are moved by that. But our thing was just stay humble, do it, take care of what you can touch. And if you do that, then different doors will open up that need to open up, and it may scale, it may not scale, but that's not your concern. You're just doing this work of whatever you can touch. Like Mother Teresa said, you can do no great things, only small things with great love. And so the emphasis is not on the size of the action or the size of the impact, but really the sincerity of the love that goes behind it. And that matters. So when you create this kind of an ecosystem, you're like, oh, intrinsic motivators. Okay, just how far can that go? Oh, non-financial, capital. Okay, well, how far can that go? Oh, just small acts, your cute little lemonade stands. And you're like, okay, when will you grow up out of that? And so you look at that, and, in 1999, there was a great story around it because we were doing web stuff, and that was counterculture, and we were not part of the whole greed train. But underneath it, it was these values that I think it was a pattern that the traditional world hadn't seen. It was a pattern of young people coming together and saying, we're beating to a different drum, and that we can use all the creativity and the enthusiasm and this energy of innovation that the Silicon Valley had, but use it in a radically different direction. And I think so when you say what is ServiceSpace, you can always talk about the different projects, and there's lots of them. You can talk about the impact, and there's a fair amount of impact. But really, if you ask me, I would say that it's these values. And I think if we stay rooted in these values, then whatever sprouts, I think is a beautiful thing in that permaculture farm.
Yeah, I love that image of the permaculture. And I love the idea of it value-based, because I think when we start to talk about like, what is it? So when I think about, uh, homeless shelters that I've worked with, or meal programs, or they have very structured, they do have to do fundraising, and they do volunteer work, and they do all those, but ultimately, say, even if all of this dried up, even if we couldn't, there's still a park somewhere. There's still a place somewhere where you can gather with people and be human together, right? To love one another, to laugh with one another, to cry with one another, to be present to one another. And that to me has been so much of what I see ServiceSpace calling, or modeling, and exempling, in that way of how it can happen. I remember the first pod that I was on, someone had done, I wish I could remember her name because I know I've seen her in other pods, but she had done like 100, or she had gotten people in Buddhist temples to do prayer mandalas. She had just invited like 100 prayer mandalas, and she posted, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is amazing. This is so beautiful. This is such an amazing thing. And I was so touched by that I realized I can do all of the ministry building, right? I can start a new program, and I can get volunteers started, and I can raise money for that. I can find someone who's going to do it, and I can build it so that I can hand it on to the community so they can continue to take care of themselves. That's all in our mindset, right? That help to lift the poverty, lift the people of a neighborhood or a community out of the poverty, and then be able to help create a structure that they can use to help themselves lift even further. Right?
Mhm.
That's give the hand up that you need and be able to walk away, and say, have a good life, and not just have a good life like see you later, but we're now connected to one
Yeah.
another.
Yeah.
That expression of love. I love you enough. I love you so much as a human being that I want to be here with you in this place, and go wherever this relationship will take us. And to just be of service, to give what I have, to give what I can
Yeah.
to somebody.
And I think that's a beautiful way to look at it, because so many times we look at even charity work or service work as, oh, I have, you don't have, let me give to you. But I think if you can, and now I think we have so much data, so much insight, even into what poverty is and what are the causes of poverty from a very scientific perspective. I mean, there's a lot, what you end up at is you can really open up this field by realizing there are multiple forms of poverty. 330 million people around the world go without seeing a single human being for 2 weeks. Like suicide is on the rise. There are more people dying of mental health issues than they are of, material issues in the world now. And so you look at all of these factors and you say, well, there are multiple forms of poverty. And then on the other side, you look and you say, well, there are multiple forms of wealth, that money is a form of wealth, and physical lack of resources is a form of poverty. But there are so many forms of poverty and so many forms of wealth. Even your presence, even just listening, is a form of wealth. Community, like you were saying, to be related is a form of wealth. Attention, is a form of wealth. Sharing stories is a form of wealth. And so you start to look at, if you expand these spectrums, and we all see so clearly that both are true now, and then it really starts to change the metric of what service is, or change the whole ecosystem of what service can be. And I think it's no longer like I need to go and, kiss up to those who have, and then be an intermediary to then give to those who don't have. Like, we know there's a lot of data that like just giving aid is actually not solving the problem over decades. So if you really start to go more and more upstream, I think you get at what you were pointing to is our fundamental relatedness. This is not to say that downstream issues are not relevant. I mean, if I was hungry, I would want food, surely. But this is also not to say that it all needs to happen sequentially. That even if I didn't have food, and I've had food from people who had absolutely nothing. I walked across India on a walking pilgrimage with my wife, and you're receiving things from people who can't even feed themselves. They're borrowing food to feed you. And you're like, no, 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 don't do that. But then you realize that it is in that giving they are receiving the sense of connection to the sacred in me and to the sacred in all life. And why would you want to say no to that? And so in so many ways, once we start to really look at all these things as spectrums, you realize, man, like every moment is an infinite gateway to the sacred, to the divine. And am I going to receive, if I hold that heart, I can really walk in. And the reward for that, I think, is very clear, is that you are related in a much deeper way than if you were transactional. So you'll still be related, even if I rob you, and you don't realize it. I mean, sure, you're related, but that's going to be a very cheap relationship versus, man, I'm just giving unconditionally to you and you're giving unconditionally to me. And together, that unconditionality is actually compounding. We can't keep it between us, and we are then going to pay forward to any expression of life that comes our way. And when we start to see it in that way, man, it's like, that's like when I imagine someone like St. Francis of Assisi, I imagine he's like under a tree and giving sermons to the birds in that mode. Like, he's not really scheming, and he's not thinking, how can I impress the donors with maximal impact, or how can I feel good about my life because I have done this stuff in the world. He's just overflowing with this, divinity. And of course, we all can't be like that tomorrow, but that's a great aspiration. I look at people like that, and I'm like, wow, someday maybe I can experience even a glimmer of that.
Yeah, I think the examples of like St. Francis, and again for us as Daughters of Charity, St. Vincent and St. Louise, these were people who kind of looked into the world prompted by a grace they were already receiving. Like as you're saying, it's whatever you call it. It is a movement that you are impelled. St. Louise talks about us being impelled by the love of Christ crucified. Comes from Scripture. This idea that the love that Jesus showed us, as Christians, we understand this. That's the love that you give to another. And oftentimes, as you're saying it, the structures, the systems, the institutions kind of begin to box it and then create a motivation. I have, you need, I'm going to give to you, I'm going to feel better. You may or may not feel better. That's not always, I hope that you do, but I know I feel better, so I'm going to keep doing it. Rather than I'm going to be down with you, because where you are is where, in the Christian and most Catholic tradition, is where God chose to preside, to live. Right? Jesus did not come as a wealthy man. Jesus came as a poor man, born in a stable. And so where will we find divine grace? Where will we find the God we follow? We're going to find him in those who have so little, because there we find the wealth of who we are as human beings, who we are as the image and likeness of the God we say we follow, right? How else will we find him? He's not in money. We know that,
Yeah.
we have all the stories, whether you follow those traditions or that faith, it doesn't much matter really. In the end, if you read scripture, you read the stories of Gandhi, and you read Martin Luther King, and you read all these amazing thinkers and people who just were out trying to do good in the world, you realize that grace upon grace upon grace is coming down into the world and answering that one question that Vincent was posed with. What must we do? And what we must do is to be love and kindness and generosity to others, give only what we have. And that has to be in some ways enough. And to receive what the other has with an openness and grace, so that that sense of, I don't know, love flows between both people. Can't just go one way, you know.
Yeah.
That to me is so amazing, and that's what I find so many times when I engage with ServiceSpace, is just this group of people who are, you know, in my computer. I haven't even met any of these people, and you know, the gift of this space has introduced me to so many amazing people who come from totally different places in the world, who respect me for who I am. I respect them for who they are, and we find this common humanity, this place where the whole idea is to be love for one another, you know, is to be that kindness, that gentleness, tenderness. The more of that in the world, the better the world can be. We'll have far fewer wars and everything else. Yeah. So talk a little bit about now. Let's go back to a little technical piece. Talk about the ServiceSpace pods.
So we started doing all kinds of dialogues, and then we were like, you know, even this can go a little deeper, you know, because dialogues are like broadcasts, they're one to many. And the thing about our retreats and our gatherings and our circles that we did, and we've done like thousands and thousands of these, you kind of see the power of many to many, right? Like that this grace is not a singular phenomenon. It comes from one person and goes to another. It's evoked in a many to many way. And so we were like, how do we do this online? And I was like, or can you do it? You know, it was like these open questions. But you're like, well, you're stuck. So you have no choice but to innovate and push in that direction. And so we started with an experiment. We called it pods. And the idea was that with the first pod, it was actually a laddership pod, June 2020. And we said, let's just do this thing for a month. Whoever wants to join can join. We thought a few people would join. Ended up being a few hundred. And we said, well, hands, head, heart. Every day you get head material, you get hands practices, and you reflect with heart. But what was really powerful about it is that, like, as people reflected, they started to see each other's responses to the same material, to the same questions, and the questions are framed in that open way. And it just helped you soften your gaze. It's like, oh, Sister Elizabeth looked at that same thing and had a very different response than I did. Oh, someone else had a very different response, and you're like 100 different responses. So you stop being such a fundamentalist around your own views. And when you do that, you actually deepen connection. And as you do that collectively, you start to really awaken like a peer learning space. And you're like, wow, someone is learning from someone in a way that I had never predicted. And it happened just because I showed up with an open heart. It happened because I showed up with a commitment, with the shared agreements of this space. And so we said, wow, there's something here. It was very moving at the end of that first month. And we're like, why should this be limited to laddership? I think we should just create a whole new platform around this peer learning notion. And so it just, you know, we've done all kinds of pods on like topics like education and business, to Rumi pod, and, you know, holding space, sacred space pod, mystical music pod. I mean, you can go down the list now. It's like, you know, so many people have engaged as a part of it. We do these 21-day challenges. We did a 21-day interfaith challenge where every day there was a different faith, and what did that faith say about compassion? And then you practice it. And it's just amazing, the safe space that's created. You know, people are like, I don't feel like chanting. You know, I remember very clearly one person saying, I don't feel like chanting Allah as my practice. And that was Sufism on day 4. And day 17 was Islam. And they get there and they're like, I'm much more in the groove now. And I can see that these are just words. And I don't know why I was so stuck to those words. I want to go underneath to the essence of it. And no one is teaching you that. No one says, oh, you come in and you do that. But what happens is you soften your gaze, because there is no teacher and it's peer-to-peer learning. So there is a spark, and there is a kind of ecosystem that's developed. But I think the real magic sauce of it is the volunteers. And Sister Elizabeth, you've been a volunteer many times. I've been a volunteer as well. And like for holding that 21-day challenge, let's say the interfaith challenge, you have people that are, you probably, I think we estimated 2,500 volunteer hours are put in for that, which in online platforms, you just don't have that. They're not even designed for that because they don't see value. They just see that as overhead. Whereas here, it's not overhead. It's like, man, I get to volunteer. And I'm volunteering not by becoming the teacher, not by taking from the center, but actually being on the edges, doing whatever is necessary, and then dissolving into the whole. And there's a kind of way to do that, and there's a system. And I think our platform is a very unique one in the fact that it precisely provides this capacity for volunteer input, but in a way that it doesn't dominate the center. It actually expands the edges, and it makes room for a deeper collective intelligence to flow. So I think we kind of stumbled onto this. I think it's a very unique design, and it's not like one person's designing it. It's designing itself. Like, the last spot you went to versus this one is going to have a lot more features, and they're just all coming up from the community. So it's really co-created by all the people who participate in this kind of a worldview where they say, oh, many to many, collective intelligence, not just center, but the edges, that kind of not just leadership, but laddership. So I think it starts to point to a design that's rooted in context and not content. You have the Coursera's of the world, which are learning platforms, but they're rooted all in content. And that's why you have 96% of the people who start these courses online and they drop out, But if you have a stronger context, then I think you end up having much deeper engagement, much deeper sense of belonging, and I think a greater ignition of a larger field.
The laddership pod, can you talk about what you mean by laddership? And then I'd like to share a little bit about what it's been like for me in this time. My life is different. When I first started, I was doing service every day with people who were refugees, recognizing, the humanity, the suffering and of these people and being with it every single day. And now I'm with young women who are entering this life to do that work and seeing that in a whole different way of being now engaging with them on what our life is like and not living the life in the way I was, but having to see both of those as service, right? And being of service to the community. So tell us about laddership.
Yeah. Maybe the easiest way to understand it is, I think, how do we design for emergence? And who do we have to be to lead an ecosystem that is designed for emergence? And I think this is something we aren't taught. What we're taught is this very traditional sort of, I have a plan, here's the execution strategy, and there's the destination that I'm going to. And that used to work, maybe 50 years ago in some cases. I would say it's never quite really worked, because there's always grace, but we can undermine that. I think there was a 16-year-old that once asked me, what advice would you give to your own 16-year-old self? And what I said was, I think when I was 16, I thought it was 90% effort and 10% unexplained serendipity. And I would say now my ratio is flipped. It's like, I think it's 90% grace and 10% effort. And so when you look and say, we are all coming together, and when we come together, there is a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. And if you want to ignite that whole, so instead of playing the additive game, right, that, oh, Sister Elizabeth brings X resources, Nipun brings Y resources, let's bring them together and you have X plus Y. So if you do that 1 + 1 = 2 thing, then I think leadership can serve some purposes there. But if you start with the notion that the plus sign also has value, that 1 + 1 is greater than 2, far greater than 2, because the plus sign, our relationship, our connecting, actually awakens a whole different field. And if you do that with a whole group of people, then what you end up with is just unrealized potential that is completely off the charts. Now, the question is, how do you hold a group of people, of beings, of life, whatever, however you frame it, in a way, who do you have to be so that you can hold all of this potential? And that really begs the question, how empty do you have to be so you allow the fullness of this collective grace to arise? And that's a question we're almost never taught in any business school. We're never taught we don't explore. It's not even, forget even teaching. I'm not so sure it can even be taught. But I think it can be caught. And I think in a field, so where what the Laddership Pod does is it's 28 days. This one is 21 days. But every day you look at a virtue and you say, well, what is the spectrum around this virtue? So you look at generosity. I'm a big fan of generosity. I've been a proponent of generosity my whole life. But you're like, okay, well, there's self-sacrifice and then there's self-care. Where do you stand on the spectrum? You look at something like humility. I'm a big fan of humility. And you say, well, there's conviction and then there is curiosity, right? There is this openness. You can look at effort and say there's something to grit and something to surrender. And so when you look you go through a whole month of these, right? And you can look at scale. You can go broad. There's something beautiful about saying, man, I want to affect so many people in a broad way. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, the Gandhis and the Mandelas of the world did that. At the same time, there's something about going deep, right? Like, so small is beautiful because small is related, and related gets you to deep work. So how do you balance like broadcasting with deep casting? So all these questions, when you go through a whole month of this, you realize that if you are saying, I stand here, 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 first of all, most people haven't done that homework. And then at some point you're like, I'm clear. I stand here, 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 right? Here are my 28 spectrums, and that's what makes me unique. And that's how I'm going to lead. And I'm going to start a project and I'm going to get to this destination. That's one approach. That would be leadership. And some of that you need. But we also need to have this different muscle of saying that, oh, I see that I have this spectrum and this collective aggregate position on all these different spectrums, and someone else has a different, positioning on those spectrums. Someone else has so even if let's say you're at a nunnery, you could get all the sisters together and you share. Everybody would not know, two people are going to land up in the same spot. Like, that's impossible. And so you start to look at this and you say, well, how can I take all these assets, all these strengths of where people are in their uniqueness, and yet fundamentally still driven by this notion of emergence, by this notion of grace, if you want to call it that, by this notion that there is a collective whole that is greater than the sum of the parts, because there's value to the plus sign in between. So this notion is laddership, right? There's no real word for it. So we just made it up, right? We were like, you are laddering something, but you are laddering this emergence. And it takes a very different kind of heart it takes a certain kind of heart to be a leader, right? Command and control. Like, I see something and others aren't that visionary, and I have the muscle and I have the fortitude to just go in and make it happen. And then there is laddership, which is a much humbler sort of, instead of being in the front of the room, you're in the back of the room. You see how everyone is related. Instead of doing these muscular changes, you're actually creating these small nudges. But the small nudges are so effective because they're rooted in a deep understanding of how everything is related. So you can create just do a little flick, and there's this amazing domino effect. And people are going to talk about that. No one's going to talk about, what is that quote? It says, it's the 100th snowflake is what creates the avalanche, but everyone wants to talk about the 100th snowflake. But maybe you're the 31st, or a ladder is happy being that invisible, like first or second, just amplifying that little domino effect so that the world has an avalanche. Avalanche, I guess maybe that's a negative metaphor.
It's all right. It's all right. When I started this pod, and of course being again in the world of formation right now, in mentoring and being involved in the life of these young women who are seeing their lives as countercultural, right? They want to, in a time in the world when this may not be what everyone else wants to do. They're choosing in their 20s and early 30s to step out of the world, to come to a lifestyle, and to do it in a church that is struggling in and of itself. We're all, faith life is struggling. It's not just the Catholic Church. It's most churches are struggling with this sense of where are we and what are we doing, and the structures of them are beginning to kind of we see the cracks in them, and we're trying to patch up what we can. And these women are making this choice. I made this choice. You've made a choice to step out of that mainstream, right? Or to step off the ladder in some way that was only going up, right? And not going wide. I always think of that image of the ladder that has like different dimensions. The ladder you want is the one that can like be a platform, or it can go straight up, and it goes all different kinds of ways, right? So when I was thinking about this for the laddership pod that we've just started, one of the questions in the orientation call was, who has been a ladder for you? Who's been. And I prayed a lot about it. I thought, well, what does that mean exactly? And I began to realize that, and again, these are history lessons for you and in my community. But St. Louise de Marillac was, as I said, she was born a questionable birth. She ended up in a convent, as a boarding school. Her dad, had kind of sent her away, and she was loved, but, she always was on the edge of her own society. She wasn't all that the other noble women were. But she, when she got with St. Vincent de Paul and they started looking at these different ways of serving, Louise began to see that the poor that needed help were not going to be able to be helped by these sisters in the cloister because they couldn't leave. So if you needed help, you had to go to them, which meant that you had to ask for help. And she saw that there was this need for just helping the poverty and the sickness or the illness or the suffering that you see, to just step into it and to do what you can. That's a very different way. This is 1633, right? This woman is working with, St. Vincent de Paul, who is also on his own journey toward seeing how the world can look differently if charity became, and in those days that's what it would be, if charity became the focus, right? Then how would the world be a different place? And I began to realize that for me, Louise de Marillac would never have known anything about me, but everything she did created a rung on a ladder for me that I could step onto and into, right? That her efforts, she was just responding to the moment in her own time, but seeing it as a place where grace was working, where divine providence was opening up for women who were field hands, right? These were servants of the women, the noble women. These were young country girls who were looking for a better life. But in 1630s, where was that going to be for a woman, right? She kind of opened up this vocation, the ability to follow your own call, right? In a world that was saying to these young women, not you, not now, probably not ever, because only wealthier women could join a cloistered community, right? Those women were educated. Those women were the kind of elite in some ways. They were praying and they were living in this cloister and they were very protected. And Louise saw that maybe what God, who she found in people who were poor, right? She found her suffering Christ in these people, said, we got to get out there. He's suffering. Can't be sitting behind a wall. We've got to get out here and touch him and feel his pain and engage in his suffering and do what we can to help bring, the salve, the balm of Gilead to people who are suffering. And when she did that in 1633, she opened up possibilities for me in 1996 to say, I also want to leave the cloister of the expectations of me as a 36-year-old woman who should have this kind of job, who should be doing this kind of thing, and had a space for me to be able to come and flourish in this life that I was looking for. That for me was what as you were describing laddership, and so I one of the first prompts we had, I wrote about how I'm beginning to realize that my prayers for vocations, right, for more sisters, for more women to choose this life, opened up a space for the 5 young women who are here right now, right? That grace upon grace upon grace is that when I engage through my prayer, through my intercession, through my works with others, just through my own promoting of the life I have learned to love, continues to open up spaces for others. It's like opening up opportunities that wouldn't be there. And to me, that is just such a beautiful concept. So I was so happy to be part of this pod this time, and hope
Oh,
I could finish.
I love it, and that notion of grace upon grace upon grace, and I think to design or to be an instrument for that kind of emergence is precisely as you said, that you have to expand your circle of care to, like, you have to plant seeds for trees whose fruits you will not be there to see. Right here we are, 1633 to 1996, and then to expand that to infinity, because that ripple effect continues to go on, right? And so who do I have to be to actually have that broad a view? How wide must my heart be to actually hold that? Because, in our world, we're actually very transactional with what we do, because that's how we find our meaning. I remember when I quit my job in my early 20s, right? Like, and people, I would go to gatherings, and remember at that time, it's like, well, yeah, I've got a lemonade stand that I've got, So they're like, what do you do? And I say, I volunteer. And people are like, no, like, what do you really do? And I'm like, I really volunteer. So it's just like, to people, it's not significant if it doesn't have a narrow feedback loop. So if you are saying I'm planting seeds for 300 years after, for a Sister Elizabeth that's coming, 300 years later, they would be like, okay, yeah, sure, but what do you really do? And that notion is completely a radical notion in our paradigm right now, that I am planting seeds and nothing more. And in fact, if you authentically, sincerely, if you look at that question and you say, even all the things that I think I have accumulated or that I have accomplished, that I have done, that are measurable, that I can go and tell somebody, I am this, I am that, I'm founder of this, that. Honestly, like, if you were to honestly look, at least I can say for myself, you introduced me as the founder of ServiceSpace. Yeah, that's true. That's a conventional title. That's fine. But honestly, like, I can't say that I started ServiceSpace. I can't say I'm sustaining ServiceSpace. I can't say that I even have a plan for a 5-year plan for ServiceSpace. So usually when people ask me these sorts of things, they're like, wait, where are you headed? I say, this is what I see right now, but who knows? We just had a Gandhi 3.0 retreat in India with all these global leaders, and it was, we had some really famous people, we had some, very, very influential people. All the people in this room would directly affect hundreds of millions of lives, so, and it was about 45 of us, and all of them, when I said, well, what is this retreat? I said, well, Gandhi stands for do external service in the world, but lead with inner transformation. Not lead with who you are, not just what you're doing. So that's Gandhi. And the 3.0 part is many to many. That Gandhi 1.0 was one of him and many of us in a broadcast model. 2.0 is more like the telephone network, where it's one-to-one kind of a network. And in India, Gandhi's successor was of that ilk. And 3.0 now, in this internet era, is a many-to-many network. And when these people were invited to this gathering, most of them had never been to India. A lot of them didn't even speak, not a lot, but at least a few of them didn't even speak English. They needed translators to be there. And, more than a dozen countries, they were all there. And I said in the invitation very clearly, I have no idea what's going to happen. This is not like Experience India kind of a trip. This is a deep trust in emergence. That if you show up with your emptiness first, or if you show up, rather, you can frame it as if you show up with your divinity first and your identity second, right? That I have my particularities. Yes, I'm a bald man, but I'm not leading and saying I want to be in a circle of bald men. I'm saying, man, I am much more than all that my mind can even process. And if I lead with that first, and I am bald second, and I am all my accomplishments second, then, and if we do that collectively, who knows what will happen? And who knows who that will impact? And when that will impact. Maybe it will be Sister Elizabeth, another Sister Elizabeth 300 years from now.
So Nipun, we've had an amazing conversation, and I feel like it's one of those conversations we could go on for hours, because there's so much. There's just so many ways. As you were saying in the beginning, there's so many forms of poverty and there's so many forms of wealth, but that when those converge together, you just see that there's so many forms in which human beings can interconnect with other human beings.
This connection to this larger field, to grace, is very primal. We had just 2 weeks ago, we had Sharon Salzberg, who was a Buddhist teacher, on she was a guest speaker in this kindness challenge, and she shared a beautiful story of this gentleman who had a lot and he had accomplished a lot. And when he was asked about his turning point in his life, he says, well, I actually was separated from my biological mother up until I was in my 40s. And he was a very big man. And so you kind of saw him when he walked into a room, he carried himself in a really big way. And he had a lot of material resources and so there was that kind of aura around him. And he's describing this moment of a reunion with his biological mother. And he says the first thing his biological mom does is he holds his hand and just goes, finger one, finger two, finger three. It's like, okay, you still got all your fingers, that like after 40 years, and she's much older, he's much older, but it was just something so fundamental, so primal, so innate. It's like we care for each other. That was just a mom showing love for her son. And I think in so many ways, our connection to each other is that, I think is that primal. I think is that innate. And I think if we tap into that, we become carriers of a phenomenal grace. So thank you for all the work that you have been doing, not just within the ServiceSpace field, but just in the larger field of life. It's so remarkable. I have deep respect for the vows that all the sisters take, and the work that you're committed to, and that relationship to the divine that is so central to everything. So I'm honored and delighted to be connected and to be reminded of those values through your work in the world. So thank you for planting seeds in me as well.